to be here at the PeaceCon. Also, Tia, would you like to introduce yourself before starting our presentation?
Thank you. I can introduce myself here. Yeah, I would have done otherwise. My name is Dr. Ziad Dawish, and I'm the lead of the project at CDA. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziad. So our presentation is divided in 3 main sections. The first part of the presentation, we will explore why a collaborative learning project in climate fragility and peace. The second part will be, we will share what the project has done so far. And finally, the third part shows the preliminary findings of our first case study of Fiji. So why a learning initiative on the Environment-Fragility-Peace Nexus now? Why? So first, I would like you to explore first, what is the environmental peace building? So according to the Environmental Peace Building Association, environmental peace building integrates natural resources management in conflict prevention, mitigation, resolution, and recovery to build resilience in communities affected by conflict. So we think this definition is quite complete because it has a holistic view of building resilient communities by preventing and addressing the root causes of environmental conflicts. Mitigation, resolution, and recovery are also key components of building peace in communities affected not only by conflicts, but also by climate change. The environmental peace building integrates 2 complex systems. So the social system integrated by people and the ecological system or nature or ecosystem, right? So the ecological system, the social ecological system is characterized by their reciprocal interaction across landscape, regional, and global scales. In the social ecological system, people use, modify, and care of the nature, while nature or ecosystems provides materials and non-material benefits to the people known as ecological services, such as water, fuel, timber provision, and places for recreation. But why environmental peace building today? So in many places of the world, we find an increase in inequality, particularly income inequality. At the same time, vital resources such as water and land are decreasing in quality and quantity due to climate and environmental change. So those resources become more expensive, and then, therefore, people cannot afford basic services to fulfill their needs and well-being. In the field, we found that inequalities and environmental stressors to resources competition, which are the main catalysts that create insecurity and that may result in conflict. And in the context of climate change, climate impacts and fragility overlap geographically, as we can see in the map. Some of the most fragile places in the world also suffer from the adverse effects of climate change. When we talk about fragile countries or settings, we refer to countries with high poverty level, inequalities, weak governance, or countries fighting war, also experiencing violent conflict. So those fragile settings are impacted by anthropogenic climate change, causing severe droughts, rainfalls, abnormalities, cold water intrusion, intense tropical cyclones, wildfire, and so on. So The problem is that fragility and climate impact have a negative feedback loop. If a country that has high levels of corruption, so citizens are probably not prepared to respond to those natural hazards. Consequently, so those people lose their houses or maybe don't have access to basic services such as water, electricity, or sanitation, which may exacerbate poverty. So having those conditions, so people who live in countries impacted by climate and environmental change with weak government structure are not adapted to shock or extreme weather events. And according to the experts, to scientists and experts in conflict or peace building, they have been saying that the intersection of climate impacts and fragility seems to increase in the near future. So, and why climate change? So climate change, fragility, and conflict is a complex causality. And maybe many of you have heard that climate change it has become a threat multiplier, meaning that the existing grievances on the ground have been intensified by climate change, or may exacerbate other threats. So, for instance, conflicts, right? So governance, weak governance, trigger conflicts, and climate change are a driver factor to exacerbate those conflicts. Also, resources, when there is a resources competition, when resources are scarce in some areas, and also migration. There is a trend, or there is in some places, there is an issue about climate related migration. So also conflict and fragility make communities more vulnerable to climate threats. Adaptation, or disaster risk reduction projects in areas affected by violent conflict are often impossible to be executed due to weak governance structures. So these areas are very often more vulnerable to threats, to climate threats. Climate change adaptation projects are rarely conflict sensitive. So in the field, we find out that some forestry projects have produced land issues in some countries. So as a consequence, this is a consequence of not having good frameworks or collaborative projects that integrates conflict sensitivity approaches. In fact, we also find out that climate change offers an opportunity for cooperation. People across the world are much better at collaborating under stress than fighting, right? So we collaborate when things get bad, and we have seen this when earthquake happens, right? So we have this opportunity to build a more cohesive society around climate threats, which is the objective of with this project. And also, we find out that, and also environmental peace builders agree that there is a theory-practice gap. We have great theory in this field, and we understand conflict dynamics very well, and we have a lot of data collection. However, practitioners on the ground don't know what to do with it. The current approaches and frameworks have very limited evidence of efficacy in addressing climate and conflict together. So CDA has answered wicked problems for 30 years. And CDA tries to figure out what humanitarian development, peace building, and even grassroots organizations are concerned with. So CDA bring together people worldwide to listen to all voices through a participatory process using a human-centered design approach. Using this methodology, CDA has come out with the collaborative learning methodology. Do no harm and conflict sensitivity frameworks were the first outcomes of the first collaborative learning project, or CLP, 30 years ago. So what we do is to conduct comparative case study across the globe, looking for patterns to develop tools and frameworks that everyone can use. In this particular case, our project is seeking to answer this research question, which is how to address the negative impact of climate and environmental change and conflict together. So we are using the CLP approach to find patterns in representative and comparable case study, to develop tools and frameworks that would be useful for programmatic interventions implemented by practitioners from international and national levels. So if you guys are interested about the CLP methodology, I invite you to visit CDA website, and then you can also find our collaborative learning project. You can find more information about our project. So this graph summarizes what it's about the Environmental Fragility and Peace Nexus Collaborative Learning Project. So this collaborative learning works on the intersection of climate exposure and fragility and conflict. So this collaborative learning, So this CLP, or collaborative learning project, uses two frameworks: conflict sensitivity responses and environmental peace building. So what CDA have done so far? So CDA launched the Climate Fragility Peace Nexus CLP in 2020. The concept node was developed in next year. And since then, the project has had important milestones, such as participating in conference, submitting journal articles, getting funds from BOS Foundation, and forming an advisory committee for the project, and conducting 2 case studies, one in Suva, Fiji, and the other one in Nevada City, Northern California. So, and how we come up with those countries to conduct our research? Well, we develop a country selection criteria. And also the project expects to conduct 15 to 20 case studies around the world. The country selection criteria was co-developed by CDA and the high-level advisory committee. Country selection is under 4 main categories, such as environmental change and impacts, governance and political dynamics, social and economic factors, and climate change and policy. Also, the project relies on a mixed method approach that integrates on qualitative methods, analysis methods, such as CDA listening methodology, informal interviews, focus group discussion, rapid ethnographic assessment, and consultation. So the project also uses climate modeling to predict climate impacts conflict drivers, and also geographic information systems to understand patterns of land or water use changes. So how did we select our initial case studies? During our participation in the Conference on Environmental Peace Building in Asia Pacific region, we realized that the widespread emerging conflicts around climate change in fragile countries in this region. So for instance, internal migration is already happening due to natural hazards or climate variability. And at that time, nobody was working on those issues. So we identified an excellent opportunity to learn about indigenous traditional knowledge also on adaptation and mitigation of climate variability already applied in the Asia Pacific region. So that is why we decided to conduct our first case study in this region. So also our objective is to select representative case study options that fit not also the selection criteria, but also it looks for places with accessible partners and security. For instance, at the beginning of the project, we saw Solomon Island as a potential first case study. However, it didn't work out due to political sensitivity. So I'm looking at other countries using the criteria selection and having partners working with local organizations in the Asia Pacific. We decided to conduct our initial case study in Suva, Fiji. Due to the availability of information and collaboration with our partner Conciliation Resources and the Pacific Center of Peace Building as a local partner. And also the Center of Peace Building, the Pacific Center of Peace Building at that time was doing a learning project in climate and conflict. So we also use that space, that legitimized process with communities to go to the field and conduct our case study. So, so this is about the project, the Environmental Fragility Peace Project, and now I'm going to invite Ziad to present the main findings of our collaborative learning project, first case study in Suva, Fiji.
Thank you, Diana. Let's see if I have sharing capabilities. I should. We should be. Can you see that?
Yes.
Ooh, great. Okay, what I want to do is quickly introduce you to the tool that we're using, the main tool. So you've seen the methods that Diana presented, and thank you, Diana. It was a great presentation. But really, what we're doing as CDA is we're a tiny organization that tries to, as the name says, learn with people around the world to basically build tools and frameworks. That's what the organization's done for 30 years. And so one of the main outcomes of this project was always to build a set of integrated tools to, on the one side, assess climate conflict, environment conflict linkages, to build programming around them, and also a conflict sensitivity tool for fragile and climate affected settings. Of course, we have all of these tools already to a degree, right? We've done this for 30 years. We've looked at all sorts of different case studies. I mean, conflict sensitivity, the do no harm approach alone has, I think, nearly 50. I think there's 47 or so. So we are not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we went back and looked at what kind of approaches are there that we've developed over the years, and how can we make them fit for purpose. And the main tool that was obvious for that is a tool that was back in the days called Reflecting on Peace Practice. It was a tool that tried to the question of the Collaborative Learning Project back then in the early 2000s was how can we make peace building projects more effective? And so the tool that came out that was a systems-based tool based around the systems-based conflict analysis. And we basically added to that tool. So let me quickly introduce the tool and then talk about the case study in greater detail. So I said our research question for all of them was, how can practitioners address environmental change and conflict together, right? So even though we do talk about climate change, a lot of the time we found in all of our case studies, and this is true everywhere else in all the work we do, is that climate change issues always go hand in hand with other environmental vulnerabilities, things like mining, things like land issues, things like species loss, or so even when we try to talk about climate change, it turns out it's always interlinked with a range of other environmental vulnerabilities. We basically built this approach based on the RPP approach, which looks at driving factors for conflict and driving factors for peace, by adding two other factors to the analysis. And they are environmental vulnerabilities and factors for resilience, that dreaded word. We start the process off with getting local definitions for that. So we often don't even use the term resilience, but try to get at how local communities withstand so we started these 4 factors, and basically all of our case studies, as they came out, and you follow them hopefully, you'll see the case studies are all arranged on these 2 factors. So in all the communities, we look at what are the driving factors for conflict, what drives conflict, what are the driving factors for peace and social cohesion in those communities. Also the particular environmental vulnerabilities, how do they interact with those factors, particular factors for conflict, and then what are the kind of what are the ways in which communities withstand conflict as well as environmental vulnerabilities. And the reason why we chose resilience is, if you're a peace building practitioner, you probably know there is in fact a very large, a growing literature that uses resilience in peace building also. So resilience becomes this sort of term, this never used term sadly, but one that we can localize. Becomes this term that brings these different fields together, not just for us, but for the practitioners more broadly. Yes.
Sorry. So your audio is cutting off, so we haven't heard you well in the past.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, yeah. You sounds like a robot. So continue talking.
We're able to hear that you're talking, but the sound is sounding like sort of morphed in a way. I don't know if maybe you can come closer to the speaker and that would help.
Yeah, I've just changed. Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah, much
Okay,
better.
sorry, I'm just off the headphones.
Yeah.
Technology, right? Exciting. What I was saying is that the reason why we chose resilience as one of the factors is because resilience is breaking the silo, is this one of these core concepts that's breaking the silo in between peace building and environmental, particularly ecology. More broadly, that's not just us, but it really becomes a focus where these different fields come together around. So we look at these 4 factors. As said, you can look at our case studies. They are all arranged around these 4 factors, but we then try to look at linkages because we think of systems thinking, as Diana said. We look at the integration of they're not actually two systems, right? We think of ecology and society not as separate. We just use them as a separate systems approach and then bring them together. Really, they are, of course, one system. So we focus on these factors and then we prioritize them with communities. We've used this approach many times now, and it's worked with community members in our case studies, as well as with high-level policy people. But really, once we have those factors and we filter them out, we understand them better, we then look at the integration of those factors, right? So how do they come together? How does climate change potentially perpetuate conflict, but also how does it lead to social cohesion, which it actually often does, right? So here's a gender sensitive, and we haven't spoken about gender yet, but the approach in the whole, as you've seen in the questions, is intersectional and gender sensitive. So we're trying to understand also how different subgroups within society, in particular based on gender, are affected by both the driving factors, both environmental vulnerabilities, and there's of course great literature out there, but as well as conflict and peace. This literature and the sort of studies on the gender environmental peace linkages is really exploding at the moment. There's really good work coming out from organizations all over the world. But to understand how these different factors could integrate or can integrate into a larger whole, this is a quick example, and I'll then show you in more detail on our case studies how it works. So we have these different factors here. The factors here, we only see one small loop. This is not the whole conflict system. But basically, the environmental impact is the worsening livelihood conditions in the upper right-hand corner. In this, they lead to diminished land and water resources. These feed a conflict factor, a driving factor for conflict, that is unequal distribution of resources, which, if you're a peacebuilding practitioner, is basically a universal one that comes up pretty much everywhere. If you follow me then down to the right with the plus, that leads to water and land conflict, which leads further down to factionalism, meaning that communities are breaking up into different factions based on water and land conflicts, which is then exploited by leaders to use clientelism, meaning you get the access to those resources through a particular leader that uses that to basically make himself stronger, which feeds into patriarchal land tenure, meaning women in this context, women have less access and control to land and water resources. It's often similar access, but certainly less control. And so once you have this conflict loop here on the left-hand side, neat little conflict loop, we then think of, okay, what are the both the factors for peace and social cohesion that could influence this loop in a positive way? How could you break that loop or weaken that system? And on the resiliency side, the light green, you see, there is, for example, in this example, there is customary rainwater harvesting that could ease some of the pressures on diminishing water resources, and therefore, weaken that link between conflict. But there's also customary egalitarian resource sharing practices, which exist in most places, that you could mobilize to mediate land and water conflict. These are often highly patriarchal, so you got to be careful with that. They're often controlled by older men, but they can be mobilized. And then adding to that a sort of peace-building intervention, a social cohesion intervention, which is an inclusive dialogue. So this gives you an idea of how using this tool, and I'll explain it to you in a second, could be used to, for example, inform food security programming, right? Where traditionally, yes, you might have included customary practices, and many food security programs do. But if you add a social cohesion component to it, you might actually make the whole system, the conflict system, weaker and the food system stronger. We come back to that. So very quickly, to just sort of use that framework and this approach to talk about Fiji. Really what was great, the local Conciliation Resources local partner, the Pacific Center for Peacebuilding, had decided themselves to look at the informal settlements as sources of conflict. They had realized that informal settlements around Suva and Fiji, Fiji being an island nation in the Southern Pacific, not far from Australia, which is where I'm, by the way, that these informal settlements, many of which you can see here around Suva, the capital, had been exploding. And they've exploded, and this is important to note, that the linkages between, so really what we're looking at in this Fiji case studies to a large degree is in-migration, rural to urban in-migration. And there's many push-pull factors. Climate change is only one of them, and maybe not even the most important. But yes, in the countryside, certainly across Fiji, land livelihood is being affected negatively by storms, by water intrusion, by land degradation, and so on. But certainly anthropogenic issues that in part are being caused by climate change and also land management issues. So rural livelihoods are declining. People are moving into the cities, largely to look for more opportunity, often in education, sometimes work opportunities. And so this is also, when we conducted this shortly after COVID, Fiji, if you know the island a little bit, or you know the islands a little bit, heavily relies on tourism. Tourism industry also broke down, which really had a massive effect on rural poverty. And so we saw, and the Pacific Center for Peacebuilding first realized that these informal settlements were exploding. This is a common finding across the world, and it seems, in fact, so there's a flagship publication of the World Bank on climate migration that was probably the first one to sort of point it out, or at least popularize the idea that climate migration will not be climate refugees coming from low-lying island states knocking on the doors of Western developed countries, which was sort of, you know, the scenario that was often painted in the West for a long time. But it turns out that climate migration primarily happens within countries, and particularly produces rural to urban migration, amongst this whole set of different other different push and pull factors. So this discussion had started that rural to urban migration, that the conflict linkages through rural to urban migration are increasing, or something to look at. The IRC, the International Rescue Committee, did a set of studies also affirming this across the world in, I think, 4 different locations, if I remember rightly. And so this was the kind of case we were looking at, right? How do environmental pressures, together with other pressures, lead to the growth of informal settlements? Informal settlements are on the rise again across the world. They were declining. So more and more people within the urban populations across the world live in these informal settlements. They are characterized by having weak or no infrastructure, no access to services, and so on. And therefore, they are inherently have issues of governance, right? There is governance issues in these settlements that exist, that have with access and control to services, but also with social and economic exclusion and marginalization based on that. So climate change in some places seems to perpetuate these inequalities, and was certainly true in Fiji too. So in a way, what we mean is there is conflict drivers that are around these. The populations grow, and these drivers are being fermented, if you want, or they're being intensified in certain ways by this in-migration. A famous case study that's often cited for environmental peace building, but is controversial, so not everyone believes in it, is that the Syrian civil war was started in a very similar manner, right? That even though it was the Arab Spring that sort of started the movement, but it was the in-migration into informal settlements in the large cities that then made the Arab Spring explode in Syria. So, of course, as peace builders, we don't just look at the conflict drivers. This in-migration, again, is highly gendered. Migration patterns often happen along kinship lines. So if you're in the countryside, you look for a settlement where you might have a cousin. But the migration is often patrilocal, meaning that you look for a cousin on the father's side, more likely, meaning that this sort of in-migration moves women out of their kinship bonds sometimes, and in those into the kinship bonds, into the larger kinship systems of the husbands. So even the in-migration already is gendered, and then of course the driving factors of conflict are gendered, as well as how social cohesion works. The main finding so if you want a big sort of piece of policy advice out of this, the main finding and out of the Fiji case study is that social cohesion produces resilience, right? So we have long, and as practitioners and as academics, we long understand that social connection is very important for resilience. That in fact, the better you're socially connected, the more resilient you are. Meaning, if you have an impact and you can fall back on borrowing food or money from your cousins, then you are more resilient. So really, what we found is that's true for social cohesion too. If a society has mechanisms in place, and here in the informal settlements, those mechanisms have to do with how different clans live together. They have to do with kinship linkages. They have to do with ritual that bonds communities together. All of these, and really astoundingly so, forge societies that are actually quite cohesive. Not like, our Western cities, for example, where nobody knows their neighbor. No, these communities really work hard on producing connection, and that connection is then mobilized once an environmental impact hits. So it's really that social cohesion and social connection are central, not just to peace building, which we've long established, but that they have this knock-on effect. So in a way, what is the finding? This is the UN Peacebuilding Fund has just I think around now is releasing their report. It's a set of case studies across the world, and certainly this co-benefit of social cohesion is one of the things they're stressing also. It seems to be a finding we can find across the world, meaning that if you are a climate practitioner and you want to invest into resilience from a climate perspective, investing actually into the mechanisms that produce social cohesion is a really great idea, right? And if you're a peace building practitioner, then often that's what you seek to do anyways. But also you can now take an environmental and ecological lens on that and say, okay, what does social, you ask an extra question, not just what produces social cohesion here, but also how is that cohesion socio-environmental, right? What are the ecological linkages of this cohesion? How can that be mobilized to make communities more resilient to increasing environmental vulnerabilities? So this is sort of the core finding of the case studies. There's many others, right? I encourage you to read the case study. Like, it's been really rich and interesting. Another major one that I want to cite, though, is it often gets lost, is the emotional and cultural impacts of that in migration, right? And across the board, we often talk about what is often termed environmental knowledge systems, but really, which is just often indigenous or customary knowledge that's been there for a very long time. You'd find that kind of knowledge in rural areas across the world, indigenous or not. But often it is that kind of knowledge that allows people to pack up and leave, or to respond to an environmental threat, or to eat another set of food sources when food is affected. Migration in particular seems to sever the link of that knowledge. That knowledge is often ecologically based and very localized. And so finding ways in which we can use indigenous or customary knowledges and practices and bring them to the cities, I think, is one of the other big questions that this case study could ask. Just very quickly, here is an initial, a simplified version of, we spoke about this tool earlier, of the systems map of environmental conflict linkages. And really at the center of it, you see a key driving factor of the conflicts is poverty and lack of economic opportunity, as you would expect in an informal settlement. It leads to intergenerational conflicts that feeds into crime, weak formal systems of governance, as you could expect. And they are worsened by climate-related rural livelihood conditions that lead into rural-urban migration, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner. And within the settlements, flooding really feeds into land conflicts, all sorts of conflicts, because the way that different families fight over the resources that are there, they're affected by flooding. And then really sort of the main resiliency factor is really social connection of the community, and the mechanisms that, I mean, astounding mechanisms that are in place in Fiji, across Fiji, to bring communities together that otherwise haven't lived together, right? Really something that we don't do in cities, which is similar in the Western world. So you think here maybe of a sports club or something. There's a whole array of things that if you move into a local neighborhood, that will make you meet your neighbors and connect with them. And that it is from my side. Thank you. I think we open up to questions. Oh, Diana, I hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziad.
Deanna, can you read my question first? It's in the chat. I can read it too.
Sure.
How do we build social cohesion, and what works and what doesn't? How are you really doing that?
That's a good question. I'm an anthropologist, and the answer of an anthropologist is always, it's specific. So yeah, certain things work across the board. But you would always have to look at what are the kind of things that culturally and socially and economically work within a particular community, right? There is always, so cohesion, one way to think about social cohesion is the glue that holds society together. So bring a diverse group of people into a room that have never met, and then try to find out what they have in common. What are the kind of things that they could connect over, right? For example, are all of them parents? Could you start a conversation over parenting? Are all of them football fans, right? Could you start a football club with them? So basically you have to figure out what a diverse group of people share in common, both in terms of, interests or things that they're already doing, right? Are they connected by class or race or indigeneity or particular experiences, like they have all lived through a civil war? So what are the kind of things they have in common? Could be one way to build social cohesion, and then use that. Another way to build social cohesion would be, what are the kind of common goals that they have? So even if they're incredibly diverse, they might all need to establish housing, and then can you do that? But basically think about, what is the glue between people? What is the social glue that make people connect, right? What's the easy way to bridge? In the do no harm approach, we often talk about connectors and dividers, right? It means figuring out what the kind of things are that are the connectors. In Fiji, and it's a great finding, really one of the ways that you build, and this is true about nation states. So think about nation state. Nation state is a collection of a very, very diverse group of people that come together, particularly in the non-Western world, have come together quite recently in history, were forced together and said, hey, you guys, whatever you are, whoever you are now a nation. I'm an Iraqi. That's what happened in Iraq. Let's get on, everyone, right? And then how do you do that? How do you give people a sense of belonging and sense of nationhood? And it turns out what's really important is symbols and rituals, right? We all have these national holidays. We all have national flags, and they forge a nation together, right? They produce this, what has often been termed imagined communities that are actually not connected, that we produce and reproduce through ritual. And it turns out that's exactly what happens in Fiji. Right? It turns out in the informal settlements, the way that people are forged together is anyone new that comes in has to be welcomed by the community, has to be integrated in the community through several steps of rituals. And you find it in indigenous communities across the world that you have to be welcomed, right? I'm sitting here in Australia. When you go to the land of another indigenous group, you have to in fact be welcomed by that group onto that land. That's a ritual that integrates. So the quick answer is, look at common connections, common goals, but then utilize what exists within a symbolic lexicon, right? What are the symbols that unite these people? And then what are the rituals? And rituals could be things like sports events, right? Or church, or anything else that commemorates. Okay, my audio seems to be echoing. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what's happening there. But yes, that's the short answer. But there's great literature out there that peace building practitioners have utilized on how to build social connection, social cohesion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And if anyone else has questions, like feel free to turn your cameras on and raise the hand or not, and just.
And also I would like to add that values, it's another way to glue people, right? So we find in the Northern California case study that the value of taking care of the land is something that glue people together. Like people are get together to take care of the land and natural resources. I'm referring to indigenous communities, right? So that value of caring also is starting kind of developing in the city, because also people, non-tribal people are also seeing that land and natural resources are key to sustain our livelihoods. So this is something that we have seen in these two particular case studies. We are in our future case studies or oncoming case studies, we are trying to see if those patterns may repeat, which is something that we look forward to it, right? Yep. So guys, also I shared the link of the case study, the Fiji case study, to you to read it, and we would like you to comment on that. And I think it's a great resource. And I don't know.
Are you going to chat for it?
Yes, Patricia. Hi.
Sorry, that was my mistake.
Okay. Some question, comments?
Was there a question? Sorry, I did it.
No, it wasn't.
I think that might be it then, no?
Yeah.
I can ask a question. I was taking some notes, and you were talking about you were using your main tool was reflecting on the peace practices, and you it was a systems-based tool based on conflict analysis, correct? So how much time, how much space away from that work do you have? Like, what is is there separation between the work and then the reflecting process, or is it, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage anyone who's interested in that to actually read the Reflecting on Peace Practice Manual. It's a workshop that you can do. It's a basic workshop-based tool. As said, really what we are is, in a way, we're human-centered design practitioners who work in a humanitarian peace building and development space. So we try to build stuff that humans can use to analyze their environment and come up with programming recommendations. You could basically run the workshop in 2 days. So you enter a community, you could do it blind, because what we are really is facilitators. You could do it without knowing anything about the community. And in a very rudimentary fashion, in 2 to 3 days, you'd have a good understanding of what's going on within the community in terms of conflict and what you need to do to solve it. Right? And so the way you do that is you build a systems analysis, one of those maps. They're always built in a participatory manner. So you don't come up with them, but you ask questions. The community works through them, and you just arrange the map in such a way you then get agreement over the map. Once you have the systems, we look at what's often called leverage points, right? How can you enter the system? And depending on who you are, you might have, like if you're food security agency, you have a different lever in the system than if you're a peace building organization or if you're a nation state. So you look at the system doesn't change, the conflict system, that map, but depending on who you are, you have a different entry point, right? If food insecurity produces conflict, the food security agency can lower the levels of conflict by infusing food products, for example, right? But yeah, so who then is in the room also allows you to find entry points into that systems thinking, and systems-based conflict analysis is not it's not just CDA that uses them, right? It's in a growing approach. It's been around for a long time, but it's really an approach that USIP uses, the German government uses, and many others. So yeah, within 3 days, you can come up with program recommendations. And when I mean 3 days, probably in something like 12 to 15 hours, in a very, very short way.
And then just a follow-up question, have there ever been circumstances where you have tried to implement new things and it didn't go the way that you thought it would, or it made things worse? Or do you see usually that things really do get better, they improve based on what you've sort of assessed and implemented?
The answer is, as peace builders, things never go the way we want them to go, because we work in fragile environments, right? They're very fast-paced, changing environments. It is very rare. So the ideal of peace building is you get people to stop fighting, and then you implement things that bring them together, and then you have a new social contract and everyone's happy. That never happens. Like never. So the whole premise that peace building is this linear progression from conflict to peace is very, very, very rare. So most of the time we end up with sort of between peace and conflict, a back and forth. And really the way to do peace building, and that's increasingly acknowledged, is that you're responsive to changes. And that means also your peace building project might have negative impacts. Not even all peace building projects are conflict sensitive. But if you practice responsive peace building, you practice the peace building that Cedric de Koenig's approach, she's very much associated with that, but now it's being used increasingly even by UN agencies, one where you monitor what happens and you respond very quickly. So you build these projects, but the projects have to be very flexible. There is major donor policies that prevent that sometimes, right? But fragile environments, by the nature of their fragility, are fast changing, meaning that you cannot build a project that will solve a problem. You have to rebuild the project as you're working on a project constantly, right? And a systems map is very useful in that, because you can see the interlinkages between different things that are going on.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Iman, do you have a question?
Thank you, Amanda. I don't have a question. I've just been sort of taking the panel in and all the things that were said. And I just wanted to say thank you to both of the panelists. I know that Saeed, you said that you're based in Australia, and I imagine it's very, very early in the morning for you. So thank you for being here. And also you, Diana, like your insights and everything that you've shared has been very welcome, and it's given me a lot to reflect on. So I just wanted to say thank you to both of you for that. So yeah.
Thank you, man. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you, man.
I think no more questions. No more questions in the chat. Do you want to wrap up, Diana?
Sure. Yes. So thank you. And I want to grow up, Siad, with the last question. So you answered that those tools are tools that we are trying to develop are to increase resilience in programmatic projects, but also it's very focused on people who are trying to survive in the face of climate change. So it's for both actors, and we are very happy to introduce our project. And if you have some questions or comments, you can reach out to us, and happy to collaborate. Thank you. Thank you, Siad and Amanda. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
guys.
Bye, everyone.